Well, happy Friday, everybody, and welcome to Keynotes from Cornell University. On today's episode, we're discussing a topic that seems to be in the news constantly, immigration. But we're looking at it from a different perspective, the economic impact of immigration. And it'll feature the Francis Perkins Professor of Economics, Professor Francine Blau from Cornell's Department of Economics and the ILR School. Fran, thank you so much for joining us in the studio today. We really appreciate it.
I'm so glad to be here, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you. And just as a quick reminder to the audience, we will be taking some of your questions, so please feel free to submit those in the audience chat. I'll be getting them on my iPad, and we have reserved time to answer them, so please feel free to submit those questions whenever you get a chance. So Fran, again, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
It's really my pleasure to have this opportunity to speak to people about such an important topic.
Yeah, it is a very, very important topic. And with that, I really want to kind of start off with a little background. How did this report come about?
Well, it's a National Academy of Sciences report. So what that very important and prestigious, I have to say, body does is assemble a panel of experts. And I had the great honor to chair the panel. And we launched a detailed examination of the issue, which involved reviewing a voluminous literature on the topic and doing some original analyses ourselves. And then we issued a consensus report across all the experts.
And as I understand it, you got a presentation that you're going to share, and we're going to show obviously to our audience. But I really want to know, is there anything we should know before you kind of dive into your presentation, or anything we should think about rather?
Well, I'd like you to think about kind of taking a step back. Okay. So we see a lot in the news, and I think the news does try to cover events as best they can, but it's hard to get the big picture from an incident here or there or whatever. So that's what I would ask.
Okay, perfect. And let's see if we can pull up that presentation for you, and I'll kind of hand it off to you.
Okay, great. Again, I'll be talking about immigration and the economy, impacts and trends, and it is based on this report. I should have mentioned the report was published in 2017. So what I've done for this talk is to update some of the data, but I am going to be drawing on this, what I think is a very insightful and helpful report for some of my analyses of the research and conclusions. So let me give you just a brief overview of what I'll be talking about. My first topic are what are the patterns of immigration and how have they changed over time. I think people don't know the history, or many people don't, and don't realize that the situation we're living in now is actually not unique. There are some historical precedents, and I'd like to talk about that.
Okay.
And then, how does immigration impact the labor market? I know that's an issue of concern to many people. What are other ways immigration impacts the economy? And what about the balance sheets of states and the federal government? How does immigration affect public revenue and spending? So those are the topics I'm going to be looking at. Let me jump right in to the historical background. So not everybody, I think, knows that the current wave of immigration is not unprecedented. Well, just stepping back, of course, we call ourselves a nation of immigrants. Only Native Americans have not come at one time or another. But there have been two great waves of immigration. I say great waves where there's just been a sizable increase in immigration. And the first one was in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And there was a large increase in immigration, like today. But interestingly, also like today, there was a shift in where the immigrants were coming from. And prior to the late 1800s, the bulk of the immigrants were coming from Western and Northern Europe and Canada. So that means countries like Germany, United Kingdom, and Ireland featured very heavily. And then starting in the late 1800s, there was a shift and where immigrants were from to Southern and Eastern Europe. So Eastern Europe, that at that time would have been the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Italy in the south. And in full disclosure, this is when my ancestors came in this wave of immigration. And
Cool.
they came from Eastern Europe.
Wow.
Some from the Russian Empire, some from the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Wow.
Now, since 1970, we're living through another second wave of immigration, and that's, of course, a large increase and a shift in source countries again, in this case, away from Europe and Canada and towards Latin America and Asia.
Okay.
And let me show you, I always, as especially an economist, always think a picture is worth 1,000 words. But this shows us the share of the population comprised of immigrants in each year. And it starts way back in the 1800s. And as you can see, there is one initial peak. And that, again, is the period of time I was talking to you about, where immigrants were headed towards were about 14% of the population. And then, and I should mention, like today, there was controversy about it. Everybody was not necessarily pleased to see this large influx and to see that it came from different areas from where they and their ancestors were from. So in this early period, we had virtually no restrictions on immigration, except actually from the Far East.
Okay.
But then in the 1920s, we implemented some very restrictive immigration legislation, which not only tamped down on numbers, but tried to influence where the immigrants were from and to push them more towards Northern and Western Europe and away from these newcomers from Italy, Russia, etc. And you can see that led to eventually a big decrease in the share of our population who were immigrants. So it bottomed out at around 5 or 6%. And then starting in 1970, the share of the population who are immigrants starts to go up again. And we're now just a little bit behind where we were then, probably headed towards 15% of the population.
And I know you might touch on this a
Sure.
little bit later on, but did the country understand the economic impact of bringing in some of these migrants at the time when they came up with some of these acts to kind of exclude some migrants? Did they understand, like, hey, this is a good thing to have some migrants come into the country?
Well, that's interesting. I'm glad you asked that, because the big change that brought in this latest wave was legislation in the mid-1960s.
Okay.
And what that did was get rid of these national origin quotas, which had, again, attempted to put immigration, source countries back towards the really the Northern Western Europeans.
Okay.
And it was kind of an outgrowth and part of the civil rights movement. We started saying, why are we essentially privileging immigrants from those areas? And so I don't know. I think that was a big push. I think that immigration is always controversial, with some people and groups focused on potential benefits and others fearful of potential costs.
Okay, perfect.
So the upshot, again, is where we've got nearly 14% of the population comprised of immigrants. But if we take in the native-born children of immigrants, that's the second generation, we're now over a quarter of our population is either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants.
Wow.
So why don't we look at the inflows themselves, what's happening to inflows? So what I was looking at before was the share of the whole population. And what we essentially have here is, going back to the late 1990s, is somewhere between 1.5, 2.5 million people coming each year.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a nosedive there. I don't know if you can guess what that is, but that's COVID.
Yeah, I was gonna say I might be able to guess.
Yeah, right around 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And it's as you can see, it's headed back up again. In terms of the available information, I don't have the most recent years, so I guess we're headed back towards where we were prior to COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one thing that concerns a lot of people is the unauthorized population. So what do I mean by that? I mean individuals who do not have documentation.
Mm-hmm.
And they may come, as was emphasized in the 2016 election, they may come from the border and enter illegally that way, or unauthorized that way. But actually, many come with visas, but they're not immigration visas, and they overstay those visas, and that's another way that people do enter.
Okay.
In any case, I think that views about immigration can differ, but a lot of people are concerned about the size of the unauthorized population and what's to be done about it. So I think I have a piece of news here that people may not be aware of, and that is, while it's true that the unauthorized population has been growing since the 1990s, it actually peaked out in 2007. And it was on a downward trajectory then, and through the amount of time that I have data. And I know that people are seeing a lot of action at the border right now, and what they call apprehensions have gone up. That's where they have detained people who are entering the U.S. unauthorized. And when those apprehensions go up, the implication is most likely people who have made it across is also increasing. So I don't know if this downward trajectory will continue or not, but I think it is very interesting that we were actually in a period where it had been declining. And interestingly, one reason it declined was that unauthorized immigration from Mexico declined, and indeed some were even returning back to Mexico. And what that relates to is actually conditions in Mexico. Okay. So population during some of the what we call cohorts, people born so that they would be entering as adults at this time, population increase rates were very high, and they've decreased in Mexico.
And how normal is it for us to see kind of these peaks and valleys as far as, over the 20th and 21st century of we see an increase in the number of migrants and then it slowly decreases? Is that normal?
Well, interestingly, that big increase was not the norm, I believe, that we saw before 2007. And there's a very interesting theory about why that occurred. And it really, I don't know for sure if it is correct, but it seems somewhat persuasive to me. And that is, as we hardened the border with Mexico and made it more difficult to come in the old days, some Mexicans would come informally. They'd enter and leave and enter and leave.
Oh, okay.
But once they saw that if they left, they might not be able to get back, they stayed and brought their families.
Okay.
So actually, in an effort to deter that kind of immigration, we may have actually increased it. But this is just somewhat. This has been offered as a reason, but I don't think we've completely nailed down if it's correct. It's a possibility.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So where do immigrants settle? And this is related in part to the response there is to immigrants. And traditionally, and this goes back a long time, immigrants have gone to what they call gateway cities and states, a subset of cities and states that are prime destinations of immigrants. And so one interesting trend is that immigrants have become more geographically dispersed. They're moving to states and communities that historically did not have many immigrants. And this means that more areas are seeing, if you will, the firsthand impact of immigration. But I should say, because it is related to resources that I'll be coming to later, that the majority of immigrants continue to reside in traditional destinations like California, New York, Texas, Florida, and Illinois. But we're seeing many more in Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and other places. So let's switch a little bit to the impact of immigrants on our population and our labor force. And I think here we are also talking about things that some people may not be aware of. In the face of demographic trends, we have actually come to rely on immigrants and the children of immigrants for our labor force growth. And let me step back and explain why this is the case and what demographic trends I'm talking about. And the two major ones are our declining birth rates and our increase in life expectancy. And I'm going to go to what I find is a very interesting chart from Pew Research Center. And these are called age pyramids. And I'm first going to show you age pyramids for the native-born population. And on the left, I have 1960, what the pyramid looked like in 1960. And you can see, on the bottom is the percent of the population that falls in one of the age categories that shows through the middle.
So are these children of baby boomers, I'm assuming?
Some of them are baby boomers.
Okay.
Depends how old they are.
Very true.
Well, actually, no, I'm sorry. Let me back up. Yes, they could still be. The baby boom went from 1946 to 1963. Okay, so in 1960, some of them are still kids. Some of them are older. So the pyramid shows, thanks for bringing that up, Nick, in this relatively still high birth rate period, the bottom of that shows the number of children there are. And you can see there that's a wide part, the bottom of the pyramid. And then we have a fairly sizable amount in what we call the prime working ages. And that's age 25 to 54. 25, except for some of our still suffering PhD students and others, you're primarily done with your schooling, most people are, and then under 55, very few people are retired. So those are kind of the prime working ages. And then we start to taper off with older people who are probably by and large or increasingly retired. So if you fast forward to the other pyramid, which was in 2018, you see it looks a little bit more like a cylinder. What's happened to our pyramid? So we have the children are not too much more than the prime age workers, and that's due to our low birth rates. And then we have a lot more people at the top due to older people living longer. Okay. So what does that mean for the labor force and the economy? Well, those people in we call them the prime working ages for a reason. They are supporting the kids at home, and they are contributing through Social Security to the income of older people. And they're kind of also what's keeping our economy and our labor force going. So you can see they have a lot more responsibilities in the native-born portion than they did in 1960. But let's look at the immigrants. So I've inserted the foreign-born age profile there on the right. And these are the population of immigrants within the United States. But two things are important that influence their age distribution. First of all, the prime ages that people come to the United States is in their 1920s, in their 20s. Not everybody, of course, but the majority are coming because they want to be in the U.S. for their prime working years. And we have a great increase in immigration over recent decades. So that puts the immigrants disproportionately. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention before, but the left-hand portion is males and the right-hand portion of the chart are females, and there's not much difference there. So in any case, that puts immigrants squarely in the population group that we very much need in the prime working years. And so you could imagine them being added to the native population and providing labor force growth that we need. Now, one thing I should say is a little deceptive about this. Immigrants are a minority of the population, so that we're not, if we put these charts together, we're not going to completely fill out those middle years, but we're going to put population where we kind of need it.
And just real quickly, with the foreign-born age pyramid, does this incorporate the large variety of migrants that come in, so not just from the southern border and maybe Latin American states, but also from Europe as well? Does that include
everybody?
Okay, perfect.
Absolutely, everybody of foreign birth living in the United States. There are some issues with coverage because we get this from nationally representative survey data. There's some concern that people in the U.S. unauthorized might not cooperate with the survey as much as others, but this is the figures that demographers feel are most accurate.
Perfect.
And it does include both unauthorized and authorized immigration.
That's great to know.
So this means that immigrants are nearly 1/5 of the labor force, 17%. And immigrants and their children account for the vast majority of current and future labor force growth, because the immigrants are helping grow the labor force coming in, and then they are, as we'll come back later, the prime working years are also the prime years in which you have children. So they're contributing, mostly actually native-born children, to labor force growth in the U.S.
Okay. Interesting. One of the things I was thinking about was when it comes to the migration of, or rather when it comes to the economy of those who are unauthorized migrants, do they also contribute to the economy as well?
They do. They come here, by and large, to work. Now, if I can sort of step aside and editorialize a little bit, we make it difficult for them. So we make it harder for them to contribute. That's why they've come, because they're looking for economic betterment and the opportunity to work. But our laws do sometimes make it difficult for some employers to hire them. And so they can be kind of stuck in a shadow economy that is not fully covered by our labor laws and things of that sort.
And was it always the case that migrants made about 20% of the workforce, or did it change depending on the different waves of migration you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, so if we go back real quick to this chart, you can see in those middle years as the share of the population that were immigrants really plummeted. So we see down to the mid-60s when they constituted only 5% of the population. And also, they were an older group by then, because many of them had come back in around the 1900, early 1920s. So it was true back in the old days of the previous Great Wave that they did comprise a lot of the labor force. But in the experience of people living today, it is a new development.
Okay, interesting. Sorry.
No, that's very
going.
great to have the questions. Thank you. Okay, so another thing that that people are concerned about with immigrants is what are their qualifications in the labor market. And this actually goes back to the last great wave of immigration. Around 1920, a famous economist wrote a paper, "Is the new immigration less skilled than the old?" So they were worried about the skills of the people from Southern and Eastern Europe, and I think people are worried about, some people, about the skills of immigrants today. So one piece of news I do want to share is that immigrant education has increased.
Okay.
Now it is, so I'll show you in a minute, recent immigrants are more highly educated than the past. Fewer of them have not completed 4 years of high school. More of them have gone to college and graduate school, again, than in the past. But native education has increased as well, so recent immigrants still have less education than natives on average, but again, more than in the past. Another interesting thing that people aren't always aware of is that the foreign-born are concentrated at the extremes of the education distribution. And they're actually overrepresented, as many people know, among those with less than 4 years of high school. But they're also overrepresented among those with more than college education, with graduate education.
Oh, wow.
Especially in STEM fields. We rely very heavily on immigrants in the STEM areas. STEM is science, technology, engineering, and math, and of course it's crucial for the development of our technology. Overall, the foreign-born share of college grads and above, taking the whole group, is about the same as natives. So this chart is there's kind of a lot going on, but I think it's interesting. The brown line that goes through shows average years of education of immigrants, and you can see that's an upward sloping line. So that's showing how immigrants are getting more education. Then let's start at the left in 1970. Each block, color block, tells you the share of immigrants with that level of education. So that kind of red rust-colored block is less than high school. Oh, I should say also, these are immigrants who entered the U.S. in the past 5 years. So they are recent immigrants. They give you, by looking at recent immigrants, we can see changes more easily.
Okay, perfect.
The light blue is those with a high school diploma. The dark blue, those with some college. The black, a bachelor's degree, and the green, a graduate education. So even then, note that a fair amount had a graduate education back in 1970, but the overwhelming share had less than 4 years of high school.
This is actually really surprising. I think it's very interesting to see this because I think for a lot of us, when we think of migrants coming into the country, we have this one view, and it's like here it shows that, you know, there's a really large majority of them who are very, very highly educated and very, very highly skilled, and I'm assuming could contribute to the economy right away.
Right.
I'm assuming.
And then if you fast forward all the way to 2012 and you compare those two lines, blocks, you see the big decrease in the share with less than 4 years of high school. See how the red or rust area has gotten smaller. High school grads have gone up a bit. Just looking at my chart. Some college. But the big change is compare the black area. 8% had exactly a bachelor's degree in 1970. Now it's 22%. 12% had a graduate education in 1970. Now it is 16%.
Wow.
Yeah. So let's get to the question of the impact of the influx of immigrants on the native-born and the economy. And I'm first going to look at a question that has absorbed enormous interest in among economists, and there have been many studies of how the influx of foreign-born workers affects native-born workers' employment and wages. And I know this is an issue that is of concern to some. Our committee spent an enormous amount of time combing through the research and the literature on this, and this represents our consensus conclusions. In terms of employment overall, we found little evidence of effects on the overall employment levels of native workers. So no, essentially, evidence of adverse employment effects on native workers overall.
Okay.
And really, for wages overall, that's across all native-born. Again, we found the long-run effect on the wages of the native-born overall was very small. So in terms of the full population of natives, not finding adverse wage and employment effects. In terms of wages of subgroups, I have italicized, if you're looking at the PowerPoint, to the extent negative effects are found, I'm going to tell you where they are. And I have highlighted to the extent negative effects are found because this was the most controversial area we looked at. We had some studies that found no evidence of negative effects, some studies that found evidence of negative effects. So we are reporting on that. And the groups that were negatively affected, interestingly, were those groups most likely to be in direct competition, if you will, with, or most substitutable with, the low-skilled immigrants that were coming in. So the low-skilled immigrants coming in had less than 4 years of high school. And we found if there are negative effects, they were on the population of native-born with less than 4 years of high school and prior immigrants. So possible negative effect on the wages of prior immigrants.
So is it kind of a farce when we hear all the time that, people say my job's going to be replaced by a migrant? Is that a farce? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yes, I think in general it's not true. In general, it's not true. Now, again, there might be specific situations where it's true, and people might have anecdotes of that. But when we look at the data overall, and we'll see, I'm going to return to this in a minute, immigrants are very concentrated in particular areas. There just tend to be some areas that they've gone to. And people outside those areas are probably not seeing much competition from immigrants. Now, another interesting thing that I think people are not aware of is that some evidence that high-skilled immigrants actually increase wages and employment of both college and non-college educated natives. So that's a very interesting finding. There's some evidence of it. There's not complete consensus yet. Why would that be? Well, one reason is they may have a positive effect on technology and innovation and entrepreneurship, which native workers benefit from. Another thing, and it's a little bit of, if I switch into economic ease, it's a little technical, but some workers are substitutable for each other, seem to be substitutes, and that's what I was saying about when the low-skilled individuals come in, who may possibly be adversely affected as relatively low-skilled natives. But some workers are complementary with each other, and complementary means you need them both. So, for example, if a high-skilled immigrant comes and starts a firm, he or she's going to employ workers without that as much education. They may be complementary with each other, so that those individuals that become employed are benefiting, as it were. And one of the assets and aces in the hole that the native-born have is their ability to speak English.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives them some degree of complementarity with immigrants. They're not perfect substitutes because they have a facility with English language that some immigrants don't have.
Okay.
So in any case, it is high-skilled immigrants may just embody, not just develop technological innovation, but they may embody the cutting edge,
mm-hmm.
and that can make labor more productive and lead to the employment of more people.
Mm-hmm.
So in any case, I find this very interesting finding.
Very much so. And we actually just got a great audience question in from Raina, and I believe I'm pronouncing that Raina, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. But Raina asks, in your view, what are some key considerations for creating immigration policies that address the economic needs of the country while also respecting the dignity and rights of individuals seeking a better life?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I wish I had a good answer to it. I think the first step is what we're doing today, trying to inform ourselves of what the actual costs are, and we haven't even gotten it fully to it yet, what the benefits are, so we can reach some idea in a rational basis of what kind of targets from our point of view. But Raina, I'm really there with you in terms of the other side, which I'm not talking about now. You know, the immigrants themselves and how they are treated. And what I would say there is additional resources would help. I think that when you see the problems at the border, some of them stem from a lack of personnel to process the applications of people who are showing up there, to hear their case in a timely fashion, to provide reasonable facilities to house people. And this is so much more important as we're starting to see whole families come and children come.
And just really quickly, we got another great question in, and I'll let you get back to it, I promise. But Catherine asks, can you do any comparison with the immigration that Europe is facing? So I know, obviously, your report was just the U.S., but is there any conclusions we can draw from this report comparing it to the immigration crisis and migrant crisis in Europe?
Well, again, another great question, and what I would just say at a very brief level is the current situation we find ourselves in, which is a large increase in authorized immigration, plus a large increase in those who seek to enter and don't have authorization, is very true across Europe. As well. They're facing similar issues and difficult decisions. The groups are a little different sometimes because the geography is different. You know, Mexico is on our border, but Syria is relatively close to Europe. So they, when we had a very difficult military situation in Syria, we had a stream of Syrian refugees seeking to enter the European Union, many ending up in Germany, for example. It's a dilemma that many countries are facing, and I don't think anyone has a full answer to it.
Catherine, thank you so much for that question. I'll let you pick back.
Oh, but I would say, I didn't even know this, but as I was updating my statistics, it said the United States, well, I hope this is correct, I'm going to say I saw this somewhere, has the largest number of immigrants. But we are a very large country, and I would say a number of European countries actually have higher shares of immigrants than we do. So we're not alone in the situation we're facing. Yeah,
that's very interesting.
Okay, so just a few more points here. So turning to benefits. Immigration has a positive effect on economic growth, and this is something that I think just gets much less emphasis and attention than possible costs or problems. First of all, I've already shown how immigration supplies prime-age workers who help to counterbalance our aging population. So I saw a research paper recently that found this, even that dip in immigration during COVID had contributed to labor shortages in areas where immigrants tend to predominate. So we are quite reliant on immigrants. And high-skilled immigrants have boosted our capacity for innovation and technological change. So how do we know this? There's fascinating research actually done by one of my panel, National Academy panel members, but also referenced by our panel. And what she found is that immigrants disproportionately contribute to patenting compared to natives. Isn't that fascinating?
That's so interesting.
Yeah, and that's contributing to growth and productivity, more output for all of us. And immigrants are more likely to be self-employed and engage in entrepreneurship than native-born.
That's so interesting.
So these are ways in which immigrants boost economic growth. Now there's other economic impacts that I'd like to mention.
Please.
So this gets back to the point I made to you earlier, Nick, that immigrants do tend to cluster in particular areas, and that means that some sectors are particularly dependent on immigrant workers. And these are sectors where the consumers in these areas have benefited from the availability of these services that are provided. And one example is child and elder care. And I could give a whole talk on the problem of child care now, where it was already difficult in terms of availability and price, but it got all the worse after COVID, during and after COVID. Home health aides is an area where immigrants are heavily represented. Food preparation, house cleaning, home repair, construction, and agriculture. Agriculture is an area that relies heavily on immigrants. Higher skilled immigrants have provided needed skills in STEM areas, science, technology, engineering, and math. College and grad school educated immigrants we get are disproportionately in those areas.
Okay.
There's actually been, and I alluded to it a minute or two ago, research that's tied some of our recent labor shortages to the decline in immigration that occurred over COVID. And you know that there has been a lot of worry about labor shortages. They found that the labor shortages are worse in areas where immigrants traditionally predominate.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Some research I did found that immigrants were disproportionately represented as frontline workers during the COVID crisis. And the last point I have on the slide is a bit of an economics point too, but some research has found that immigrants may help to make labor markets more efficient because they're willing to flow geographically where the opportunities are. So when they first come to the U.S., economic-based immigration, the immigrants try to go where the jobs are. But then if the situation changes, they're more willing than natives to relocate because they're not as tied. They didn't grow up in place X or place Y. So that helps it's believed to help the labor market function better. So how are we doing for time? Okay, a few more minutes. Yeah, okay. So let me just close by looking at the fiscal impact of immigration, and that word fiscal is talking about the balance sheet of state and federal, in this case, state and federal governments. So what is the impact of immigrants on this balance, fiscal balance? And to do that, we want to distinguish the contribution that immigrants make to revenues by paying taxes, and I put that in green, versus immigrants' contribution to government expenditures, I put that in red, by consuming public services. And this actually was a huge amount of research. We had some excellent people looking into it, and I could give a whole talk on this, but I'm just going to briefly summarize. And it's kind of interesting. Taking people as individuals, and what I mean by there is regarding people as individuals rather than members of the families.
Okay.
The fiscal picture looks very good for immigrants, and that's because, as we've seen, they're concentrated in the prime working ages when you're most likely to contribute to government revenues in terms of taxes. Children, as you may know, don't contribute to revenues of their parents or the government.
Yeah.
And older people have, by and large, eventually retire and are receiving Social Security, and they're not contributing as much to revenues. But interestingly, if you take people as families, it adds a complication, because immigrants are at the age when they're most likely to be in the labor force, but they're also at the age when they're most likely to have children present. And children, again, don't contribute much to revenues. A lot of these children are native born, by the way. So primarily for this reason, immigrants have a lower fiscal contribution than natives, especially at the state level. And this is primarily due to educational expenditures, the money that's spent to educate the children of immigrants. Now, this conclusion is correct, but how we should view it was a matter of some controversy in the panel, because we did want to provide this information, but we also wanted to provide an important qualification, and that is you could regard expenditures on education as expenses, but it could also be considered investment in the future. We're investing in the education of these children, and we're going to reap rewards from that when the children grow to adulthood and are contributing to the labor force and paying taxes to the government. And interestingly, what we found is in the long run, the ACE top contributors to government revenue were the children, the native-born children of immigrants that we call the second generation. They went on to have the most positive fiscal contribution.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Compared to the immigrants themselves and also the native-born.
And is there one area where we see the migrants have the most economic impact? So is it at the local level, at the national level, at the regional level?
That's a really good question. It's a little bit almost of a conflict of interest between the state and the federal government, because the federal government doesn't pay that much of the educational expenditures. So where those are coming are at the state level. The federal government is getting the positive federal tax payments of the parents and reaping that their Social Security contributions to help support people on Social Security. So that's the last bullet point, actually. There might be an argument for the federal government subsidizing the cost of education of the children of immigrants, since the federal government will benefit from their tax payments as adults, disproportionately benefit. The state will benefit as well, but the federal government benefits more. And let me say that this does go to other things that I have seen in the news, where cities are complaining about how are we going to house all these immigrants? How are we going to help them transition to the U.S.? Because, they show up in New York City, or they show up in Chicago, or they show up in Texas. And I think there's an argument for the federal government bearing a higher share of those expenses, and I think it would reduce the anti-immigrant sentiment that we see in some places.
So you think that would kind of counteract the cost a little bit and take a little bit of the burden off the cities?
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. And actually, while we're talking about taxation and everything like that, we actually just got a great question in from Kenneth. And Kenneth asks, are the undocumented workers who add to the labor force also subject to taxation? The vast majority of Texas farms do not report this business expense or taxable income. If they aren't paying into Social Security, how is the government going to care for them during retirement?
Yes, that is a great question, Kenneth. Here's my understanding, and that is that I believe it's the bulk of unauthorized immigrants have fake Social Security documents.
Okay.
So they actually do pay Social Security, but they don't receive. They're not going to receive it unless they can regularize their status. They're under other names. So I thought the unauthorized were actually a bit of a good deal in that they pay in, but they're not eligible for
they won't receive Social Security.
So I don't know, Kenneth, about what's being reported on the Texas farms. I just don't know about that.
Okay. And you mentioned, migrants transition over to, the different areas and they kind of float where the jobs are. Are there specific regions where, migrants generally go to and then move into? So I'm thinking, for example, if there's a bunch of jobs in the city, are they generally in the Northeast? And then if there are jobs that open up down south, so they transition down south. Do you see a pattern at all as far as where migrants start out into and then migrate to?
Well, I don't. It's a very interesting question. I don't have detailed information on where they're moving, but they do start out, again, primarily, but not only in these gateway cities and states, California, New York, Texas, Florida, and Illinois, where the bulk will start out in any case. But they are spreading to a number of areas, and I'm assuming that's in response to opportunities in the labor market there, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina.
And do we ever see any upward mobility as far as highly skilled migrant workers go? So I'm thinking if a migrant gets a job at an entry-level position and they continue to grow in the company, do we ever see that often?
The impression is that they do. I don't know if it's been studied in detail, but that people do move up, that they might have to start below their qualifications in some cases because the qualifications may not be fully transferable to the U.S., but that they do have opportunities in many cases to move up. And then in some cases, very skilled people do come in the tech area, and their credentials are entirely recognized.
And you mentioned this a little bit before, but I just kind of want to clarify. What are some of the fields that you see or that we see that have a large number of migrants in it?
Yeah, so I think there were two types of fields. One is, again, the high-skilled, and that's in disproportionately, not only in the STEM areas. But then the low-skilled, or I would say in service, broadly speaking.
Okay.
And spilling over into health care and health aides, elder care, child care, and then house cleaning, home repair, food preparation. Construction happens to be a big area.
Okay, construction. That's good to remember. And
agriculture, as Kenneth's question was
yes, the farms in Texas. Thank you so much for that question, Kenneth. And S. Raven checks in with a great question. So S. Raven asks, current green card wait times to certain countries are very high as they are contributing more to the economy. Do you feel, do we need more changes in policy to clear the backlog? So I think what they're trying to get at is the fact that green card wait times are so long, but they are continuing to contribute to the economy.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And what I'd like to see my role more in giving the audience and policymakers the information about how to address these questions. I will say that I have seen some very interesting research that one of my PhD students did, where they documented these incredible wait times.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that some highly skilled immigrants that might have come to the U.S. are now going to Canada, where there's more effort to recruit highly skilled individuals and the wait times are shorter. So it's a very important issue in question.
Mm-hmm. And what are kind of some of the long-term effects that we can maybe see, or maybe some of the long-term effects that just kind of come to the top of your head regarding 5-10 years down the road as we kind of continue to see some of the number of migrants drop off?
If we do see a drop off, I think we're facing labor shortages and a kind of stagnation. I think our output can keep growing, but there's
Mm-hmm.
a kind of stagnation in society that is disproportionately, to be honest, comprised of older people, mm-hmm. and does not have as many people in these prime working years. Mm-hmm. And this is not just a U.S. problem. It's a big problem in a country like Japan, but they have not turned to immigrants. Mm-hmm. And I think they have grappled with it. Mm-hmm. China, which is not very easy to immigrate into, is facing a population imbalance with a very low birth rate. They had an increase in life expectancy, mm-hmm. and their population is starting to shrink.
And I'm wondering if we'll see the prime working age, like you mentioned, change a little bit over the years. Is obviously
that's very interesting.
The number of older people working obviously changes. So I'm wondering if...
Wait, what are you looking at me?
No, but I'm thinking...
that you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
Healthcare and medicine getting better and better, if this mm-hmm. new group of migrants maybe will be working longer and contribute more and more to the economy as they get older.
Well, that's a very perceptive question, because also people do point out, and you're quite right, that I have emphasized the contribution immigrants are making to the prime working ages, but they're not exempt from getting older either. So they will get older, and I think that that is a very interesting idea that has been mentioned, that people can work longer.
Okay. And thank you, Fran, so much for joining us. One last question. If you could kind of reach out to the audience, give them, one thing to think about or one thing to walk away with. Obviously, it's a major topic in audience. We didn't get to everything, but what's that one thing you would want the audience to kind of walk away with?
I think, and it is hard to choose, I think that there are benefits as well as cost. Immigration is the most important message that I would like to get across, and my mm-hmm. bottom line.
Mm-hmm. Fran, thank you so much for joining us. Audience, thank you so much for joining us and watching us. We hope you learned a couple of things. Have a great Friday, have a great weekend, and we'll see you at the next keynote. Have a great afternoon.